Hey everyone, ready to dig into how cities can turn those kind of, neglected spaces into something awesome for the community?
I know I am.
Today we're diving into Baltimore's Green Pattern Book. It's like this super cool guide to, totally transforming vacant land.
Yeah, it's a really innovative approach, and it comes at a perfect time, with cities all over trying to figure out what to do with these vacant properties. What Baltimore's doing could be like a model for other places.
Totally. And we're not just talking about like slapping some paint on an old building. This Green Pattern Book lays out 8 green patterns, and they're pretty amazing. Think urban farms, rain gardens, even parking lots that are, get this, eco-friendly.
Right. And it's not just about making things look pretty, it's about tackling some really big challenges. Just think about Baltimore in 2013. They had like 14,000 vacant lots just sitting there, plus another 16,000 abandoned houses.
Whoa, that's a lot of empty space.
It is. And those properties, when they're just sitting there, they can attract crime. They can bring down property values.
Hmm.
And they can create this sense that nobody really cares about the neighborhood.
Yeah, it's like you bite into this delicious apple and there's a worm inside. Ooh, not what you want. But this green renaissance thing they're doing in Baltimore, it's like they're trying to replace that worm with, well, something way better.
Exactly. They want to turn these eyesores into something beautiful and useful. And those 8 patterns we talked about, those are the key. So let's start with the first one. It's called Clean and Green. And it's basically about keeping these vacant lots clean and mowed and making sure they're safe.
So it's like step one,
Yeah,
get everything cleaned up and ready to go.
exactly. Like getting the soil ready before you plant a garden.
Got it. So you start with a clean slate. Then there's community managed open spaces. It sounds like it's all about letting people in the neighborhood create their own gardens or orchards or even little parks, right in their own backyards.
Exactly. It's all about letting communities create the spaces they need and want. And then there's urban agriculture. This is about bringing actual farms right into the city.
Wait, hold on. Urban farms. Now, are we talking like rows of corn growing between skyscrapers?
Uh-huh. Well, maybe not corn between skyscrapers,
Yeah.
but you're getting the idea. It's about growing food in the middle of the city so people have easier access to fresh fruits and vegetables, especially in those areas where there aren't a lot of grocery stores. Plus, it helps the local economy too.
So it's not just about making the city look better, it's also about helping people eat healthier. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, what about stormwater management? I have to admit, that one doesn't sound quite as exciting.
Oh, but it is. Trust me. This is where things get really interesting. We're talking about taking those vacant lots and turning them into rain gardens and bioswales. Those are like these landscaped areas that are designed to like capture rainwater and filter out all the pollutants.
So instead of that rainwater just flooding the streets and carrying all that pollution into like the rivers and stuff, it gets cleaned up naturally.
Precisely. And they can be really beautiful too. They can really add something special to the neighborhood.
I'm starting to see how all this comes together. What's next?
Well, we can't forget about our cars. Green parking is about designing parking lots that are more eco-friendly. So think things like permeable pavement and trees, and you guessed it, those rain gardens we were just talking
Yeah.
about, all of that working together to make parking a little more sustainable.
Wow, so even parking lots can be green. This is awesome. What about urban forests and buffers? Does that mean planting like mini forests in the city?
You're catching on quick. It's
Yeah.
about creating those little forests and these green corridors, woven right into the cityscape. They can help clean the air, reduce noise, and they can even create habitats for wildlife.
It's like giving the city a breath of fresh air. Yeah. Literally. Okay, what are the last 2 patterns?
Neighborhood parks, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's about taking those big vacant areas and turning them into places where people can relax and play. And then the last one is mixed greens. That's the most flexible approach because it allows communities to combine different patterns to create something that really works for them.
So it's not one size fits all. It's about finding the right mix. I'm curious though, how do you actually make all of this happen? Like in real life?
That's the cool thing about the Green Pattern Book. It doesn't just talk about ideas, it actually tells you how to do it. It answers all the practical questions, like who owns the land, how much it costs, and how to even take care of everything once it's done.
It's like a recipe book for greening the city. Speaking of recipes, I'm always a sucker for a good success story. Are there any examples of these green patterns in action that really show what's possible?
Absolutely. There's this place called Strength to Love Farm. It's a 1.5-acre urban farm, and it's bringing fresh food and jobs to this neighborhood in West Baltimore that really needed them.
Wait, a 1.5-acre farm?
Yeah.
Right in the city? That's incredible.
It is. And then there's Mikaderi Rain Garden Park. It's this little rain garden, but it makes a huge difference. It beautifies the neighborhood and it helps manage all that stormwater runoff. It just shows that even small things can make a big impact.
It's like those tiny houses that are super popular right now. They pack a lot into a small space. What else?
Oh, and then there's the new Broadway East Community Park. It used to be 18 vacant houses, but now it's this amazing community space with green parking, trees, and benches made from recycled paper.
Whoa, that's a complete turnaround.
All right.
From eyesore to awesome. It sounds like the Green Pattern book is more than just a guide. It's like this roadmap to a greener, more sustainable future for Baltimore.
Exactly. And the best part is other cities can learn from what Baltimore's doing. It's proof that you can create something beautiful and sustainable, even in those places that have been neglected.
So what are we waiting for? Let's get into the details of how to make these green patterns a reality. Where do we even start?
Well, before we grab our shovels and get to work, let's talk about this really cool project that showcases all of this in a unique way. It's called the East Eager Stormwater Park.
East Eager Stormwater Park. I haven't heard of that one. What's so special about it?
It's a perfect example of that mixed greens pattern we were talking about. They're taking this one site and using several different greening strategies all at once. It's like a combo platter of green goodness.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So picture this. A 1-acre site, totally neglected, and now they're turning it into this multifunctional green space. They're using rain gardens and bioswales to manage all the stormwater, and they're creating this awesome community gathering space all in the same spot.
It's like a green oasis that also serves a practical purpose. I like it. Where exactly is this park?
It's in the Station East redevelopment area, right next to some railroad tracks. They couldn't build houses there because of the tracks, so they decided to turn it into a green space that everyone can enjoy.
Turning a limitation into an opportunity.
Yeah.
I love it. How did this project even get started?
It was a team effort. You had HABISAC, which is the Historic East Baltimore Community Action Coalition, working with Baltimore Housing, the Maryland Department of Transportation, and the Office of Sustainability.
Whoa, that's a lot of players. They're really pulling out all the stops on this one. So, what's the plan for this park? What can we expect to see there?
Well, they're doing it in phases. Right now, they're focusing on cleaning up the site and getting it ready for the transformation. That clean and green approach we talked about earlier.
So back to basics, huh? Clear the clutter and create a clean slate. What comes after that?
Later on, they'll start adding those stormwater management features we talked about, like rain gardens and bioswales. And they want to add things like trees, benches, and maybe even walking paths to make it a really inviting space for the community.
It sounds like they're trying to create a space where people can really connect with nature and with each other.
Hmm.
I can already picture myself sitting on a bench under a shady tree, listening to the birds sing.
It's definitely a vision worth striving for. And the East Eager Stormwater Park is proof that you can transform even those really challenging sites into something beautiful and beneficial.
I'm impressed. So how can people find out more about this park and maybe even get involved?
We'll be sure to include links to all the info on our website, so definitely check that out. But for now, let's shift gears and dive into some of the other awesome things in the Green Pattern book.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready to learn more about those 8 green patterns and how we can create more green spaces all over Baltimore.
One of those patterns that I think is just so cool is community managed open spaces.
Yeah.
CMOS for short. It's all about giving the power back to residents, letting them shape their own neighborhoods.
CMOS, huh? Sounds like it's all about letting people create their own little green havens right in their communities. So what kinds of spaces are we talking about here? Give me some examples.
Oh, there's so much variety. You could have community gardens where people grow their own food, or orchards bursting with fresh fruit, or even those little pocket parks that give you a break from the city, A little peace and quiet.
Like choose your own green adventure. I
Yeah.
like it. So let's say a group is ready to jump in and create a CMOS. What's the first step? Where do they even begin?
The Green Pattern book says there are 2 super important things to think about when you're picking a spot. One is the group's capacity, like how much can they really handle, and the other is proximity. How close is it to the community?
Okay, capacity makes sense. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew, right? But what about proximity?
Well, you want to make sure that the space is easy for people to get to, the people who are going to be using it and taking care of it. If it's way out in the boonies, nobody's going to go there.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like picking the perfect spot for a picnic. You want it close enough to enjoy without having to pack like A week's worth of supplies.
Exactly. And the Green Pattern book says groups should also think about things like who owns the property? How big is it? Is it on a hill? Can you get water there? What's the soil like? Even what's going on around the lot.
Wow, that's a pretty long list. It
Wow.
seems like you need to do a lot of homework before you even start digging.
Yeah, but it's all about setting yourself up for success, right? Like, for example, who owns the land? That's a big one. You want to make sure that the lot is actually available to adopt.
Right, because you don't want to fall in love with a spot and then find out that it's not even an option.
Exactly. And even then, you need to have the right agreements and permits in place.
Ugh, paperwork. The not so fun part of greening the city. So, what are some of those must-have agreements?
The most important one is this thing called an adopt-a-lot license. It's from Baltimore Housing. It basically gives you permission to use the lot for your CMOS project.
So that's like your golden ticket, right?
Pretty much.
Okay. What about other permits? Do you need like a special license to plant tomatoes?
Haha, not exactly. It really depends on what you're doing. Like if you're building a fence or a gazebo or you want to keep chickens, yeah, then you might need some extra approvals.
Got it. So permits are kind of a case-by-case thing, but the Green Pattern Book helps you figure all that out, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's your guide to all the red tape. They want to make it as easy as possible for people to do these projects.
That's great to hear. Okay, so once you've got all your paperwork in order, it's time for the fun part, designing the space. What are some things to think about when you're designing a CMO West project?
The Green Pattern book says it's really important to pay attention to solar orientation. That's just a fancy way of saying where does the sun hit the site?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. You don't want your garden to be in the shade all day.
Right. And they also say to think about where the lot sits on the block. Like if it's a big lot and you're doing a garden, maybe put it towards one end so there's room for other things too.
It's like playing Tetris with green spaces.
Haha, you got it. And then, of course, safety is super important. You don't want landscaping that creates blind spots or hiding places, right? You want it to feel open and welcoming.
Yeah, you want people to feel safe, not like they're walking into a jungle or something.
Exactly. And then there's water access. That's a big one, especially if you're doing anything that needs to be watered, like a garden.
So can you just, like, hook up a hose to a fire hydrant?
Haha. It might seem that way, but it's not that simple. The Green Pattern book says you should contact the Vacants to Value program at Baltimore Housing, and they can help you figure out the best way to get water to your site.
So some lots might already have water, and others might need a little extra work to get it hooked up.
Yep, that's right. And that's something to think about when you're putting together your budget.
Speaking of budget, all of this can't be free, right? Are there any resources out there to help communities pay for their CMOS dreams?
Totally. There are a bunch of grants available, and the Green Pattern book lists some of them, like grants from organizations like Parks and People and the Chesapeake Bay Trust. And then there's this really cool thing called the Baltimore Community Tool Bank, where you can rent tools for super cheap.
So there's help out there for people who want to get their hands dirty. That's awesome.
It is. And the Green Pattern book encourages communities to get creative with their financing, you know? There are lots of ways to make it happen.
Now let's talk about something that I think sometimes gets overlooked. Maintenance. You create this beautiful green space, but who's going to take care of it?
Well, that's part of the Adopt a Lot agreement. The community group that adopts the lot, they're responsible for keeping it up.
So it's a commitment, but I guess it also gives the community a sense of ownership, right?
Totally. And the Green Pattern book offers some tips on maintenance. It says it's really important to make sure that the space you choose matches your group's capacity, you know, what they can actually handle.
Right. It's like choosing a pet. You wouldn't get a Great Dane if you only have time to take care of a goldfish.
Haha, that's a perfect analogy. Start with something manageable. And the book also says it's super important to have a maintenance plan from day one. Like who's going to do the weeding,
Yeah.
the watering, who's going to keep things looking tidy.
So it's not just about planting a few flowers and walking away.
Nope. You got to keep at it to make sure that space really thrives.
It's a team effort, everyone pitching in to keep their little corner of the city beautiful. I'm curious, are there any CMOS projects in Baltimore that really showcase how well this can work?
Oh, yeah, definitely. One that comes to mind is Brentwood Commons. It's this community area, about an eighth of an acre. It's protected by Baltimore Green Space, which is like a land trust that helps preserve these community-managed places.
So this space is safe. It's not going to get bulldozed to make room for another condo building or something. What's so special about Brentwood Commons?
Well, it's a great example of how CMOS can be multifunctional. You know, they have picnic areas and all this beautiful landscaping and even parking, and it's all designed and maintained by the residents.
Wow. They've got it all. What do they do to transform this empty lot into something so amazing?
They did a ton. They planted 11 trees, added shrubs and grasses and flowers, and created this cool path using mulch and cobblestones that were donated. Oh, and they put up these wooden bollards to kind of define the
It's
space.
like they gave it a complete makeover. But all those improvements, that must have cost a fortune, right?
Oh, might be surprised. The whole thing only cost about $2,500.
$2,500. That's incredible. How do they do it so cheap?
That's the beauty of community, you know? A lot of the stuff, like the cobblestones and the mulch and even the trees, they were all donated by the city. And then you had volunteers from the community and this nonprofit called Civic Works. They all pitched in and did a lot of the labor.
So it was a real community effort.
That's awesome. And who takes care of Brentwood Commons now? The residents do. They weed it, they prune it, they mow it, they keep it looking good.
That's dedication. How long has Brentwood Commons been going strong under this community-managed approach?
Over 10 years. It just shows you that these CMOS projects, they're not just quick fixes. They can really have a lasting impact. They can create this sense of pride and responsibility that can last for generations.
Brentwood Commons sounds like a great example of how a community-led green space can really thrive.
Yeah.
What's the big takeaway here when we think about the power of CMOS?
I think it shows that these projects can be a really powerful way to revitalize neighborhoods, you know, bring people together and make them feel like they have a stake in their community.
It's a reminder that even small spaces, when they're managed by the people who live there, can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Brentwood Commons is a great example of how those neglected spaces can be transformed into something vibrant and meaningful for the whole community. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about another really cool aspect of the Green Pattern book, urban agriculture.
Urban agriculture. Okay, I'm intrigued. Now I'm picturing rooftop gardens and vertical farms like sprouting up all over the city.
Aha. Well, those are definitely part of the whole urban agriculture movement, but the Green Pattern book is focused on something a little more down to earth. They're talking about turning vacant lots into, get this, actual farms.
Real farms operating in the city.
Exactly. And it's not just about those little community plots, it's about supporting farms that can actually make a profit and help boost the local economy.
Wow, so we're talking about real commercial scale farming happening right here in the city limits. I'm curious, how does the city help make this happen? Is it just like a free-for-all, or is there a process?
The Green Pattern book talks about this program called the Homegrown Baltimore Land Leasing Initiative. Basically, the city, through the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, they lease these vacant lots to farmers who are like qualified to do urban agriculture.
So the city is actually making land available specifically for this purpose.
That's awesome. But what does it take to be a qualified farmer? Do you need a degree in agriculture?
You don't need a degree, but you do have to have at least 1 year of farming experience,
Yeah.
so they know what they're doing.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want to give someone a plot of land if they think tomatoes grow on trees. Okay, so once a farmer has the experience, how do they find the perfect spot for their urban farm?
The Green Pattern book lays out some things that both the farmers and the city need to think about when they're choosing a spot. Size is a big one. Ideally, you want the farm to be at least a half acre, but an acre or more is even better.
That's a lot of space. It sounds like we're talking about real farms here, not just little backyard gardens.
You're right. If you want to do commercial urban agriculture, you need space for planting and equipment, and maybe even some structures like a greenhouse or something.
I can see that. So size is important. What else do they consider? Location, location, location. You don't want to put an urban farm right in the middle of a residential neighborhood where it's going to be noisy and cause traffic and maybe even have some smells that people don't like. The Green Pattern book says it's important to have the farm close to residents, but not so close that it's a nuisance.
So it's about finding the right balance. Close enough to benefit the community, but not so close that it becomes a problem.
Exactly. Along with size and location, they also talk about the slope of the land, you know, if it's hilly or not, how many trees are there already, and whether you can get water to the site. Oh, and the soil conditions, too.
Okay, the slope and the trees, that makes sense. Flatter land with fewer trees is easier to farm, but water is super important, right? How do urban farms usually get their water?
That's a good question. The first thing they do is check to see if there's an existing water meter pit on the lot. If there isn't, then the farmer might have to pay to install a new water line.
Oof, that could get expensive.
Yeah, it can be. But the good news is there's a program that can help. It's the Water Access Assistance Program, and it's run by the Baltimore Office of Sustainability. They can help nonprofit urban farms with stuff like that.
That's great to know. What about soil conditions? Urban soil can be pretty contaminated, right? Is that a problem for these farms?
It can be. The Green Pattern Book says it's really important to test the soil to make sure it's safe for growing food. If it's got too much lead or other toxins, then they might have to bring in clean soil from somewhere else or maybe even figure out a way to clean up the soil that's already there.
So urban farming,
Mhm.
it's not as easy as just throwing some seeds in the ground, huh?
Nope. You really got to plan it out carefully and pay attention to all those details.
So let's say a farmer has everything they need, the experience, the perfect spot, and the soil's all good.
Hmm.
What happens next? How do they actually get the land?
There's a process they have to go through to get the lease. First, they fill out this pre-qualification application. You can find it on the Baltimore Office of Sustainability's website.
So I guess that application lets the city kind of check them out, right? Make sure they have what it takes to run a successful farm.
Exactly. It's like the first hurdle they got to jump over. If they pass that test, then they work with HCD and the Office of Sustainability to find some good spots for their farm.
So the city helps them find the right location.
Yep, it's a team effort. And once they find a good spot and the people in the neighborhood are okay with it, then HCD draws up this lease agreement, and it's for at least 5 years.
5 years. That's a pretty long time.
It is, but that's on purpose.
Yeah.
They want to give the farmer enough time to really invest in their farm and build something sustainable.
Yeah, it takes time to build a farm and get it running smoothly. 5 years makes sense.
And then the final step is it has to be approved by the city's Board of
So
Estimates.
they make sure that everything's on the up and up. Once the lease is signed, are there any other permits or approvals the farmer has to worry about?
It depends. Like, if they want to build a fence or a shed, or if they want to have animals, then they'll need to go through the normal permitting process.
So even though it's an urban farm, they still got to follow the rules.
Yep, that's right. But the Green Pattern Book explains it all so it's not too confusing.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. The lease is signed, the permits are in hand. It's time to actually design the farm. What are some of the big things to think about when you're designing an urban farm?
Access is a big one. The farmer needs to figure out how they're going to get all their stuff in and out, the equipment, the supplies, the crops they harvest.
Right, you don't want tractors driving down narrow streets or delivery trucks blocking traffic.
Exactly. And the Green Pattern Book says they should think about where they're going to put any buildings or structures, too.
Yeah.
There are zoning rules, that say how far away from the property lines those buildings have to be and how tall they can be.
So even though it's a farm, it still has to fit in with the city.
Right. Yep, that's right. And then there's all the little details, too, like where do you put the trash? What if you have to tear down an old building? What do you do with all that debris? Do you want to use hoop houses or raised beds for planting?
It's amazing how much planning goes into creating an urban farm.
You said it.
Speaking of details, let's talk about water again. We know it's important, but how do urban farms actually do their watering? Is it just a matter of running hoses all over the place?
Hoses are definitely part of it, but the Green Pattern Book encourages farmers to think about using irrigation systems that don't waste a lot of water. Because water conservation is really important, especially in a city.
That makes sense. Okay, what about the soil? We talked about contamination earlier, but are there other challenges that urban farmers face when it comes to soil?
Yeah, sometimes the soil's really compacted, or it doesn't have enough nutrients, or it's just not right for growing certain kinds of crops. The Green Pattern Book recommends some strategies for dealing with that, like bringing in clean soil from somewhere else, or building raised beds, or even trying to clean up the existing soil.
So urban farmers, they have to be pretty resourceful.
They do. They have to be adaptable, just like any farmer, but maybe even more so in a city environment.
Now I'm wondering, what kind of stuff grows best on urban farms? Is it just fruits and vegetables, or can they grow other things too?
The Green Pattern Book mostly focuses on fruits, vegetables, and herbs, because that's what people in the city need. But it also says farmers should think about trying some new things like agroforestry and aquaculture.
Agroforestry, aquaculture. Those sound interesting. What are those?
Agroforestry is like a mix of trees and farming, so you might have fruit trees planted among your vegetables or trees that provide shade for your animals. It's about making the whole system more diverse and sustainable.
That's so cool. And what about aquaculture? Is that like raising fish?
Yep, exactly. It's about farming things that live in water, like fish or shellfish. Imagine an urban farm that grows fresh, produce A&D seafood right in the heart of the city.
Now that's what I call sustainable city living.
Yeah.
Okay, before we move on, I gotta ask, are there any urban farms in Baltimore that are doing a really great job? Farms that really showcase what this green pattern is all about?
Oh, there are tons of great examples, but one that I always think of is Strength to Love Farm. It's in West Baltimore. Remember we talked about them earlier?
Yeah, I remember. They were the ones bringing fresh food to that neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of grocery stores.
Yep, that's the one. It's a great example of how urban agriculture can help people get the food they need and create jobs at the same time. It's been around since 2013, and they're doing amazing things.
It sounds like a real ray of sunshine in that community.
It is. And it's not just about growing food, they also create jobs and training opportunities so people in the neighborhood can learn how to be part of the local food system.
So it's about empowering people, not just feeding them. I love it.
Me too. Strength to Love Farm, it's a real inspiration. It just shows how urban agriculture can transform a neighborhood, make it a better place to live and make people feel good about where they live.
That's an awesome story. Okay, let's move on to another super important topic, stormwater management.
Stormwater management. Yeah, it might not sound as exciting as urban farms or community gardens, but it's really, really important for keeping a city healthy.
I agree. It's one of those things we don't really think about until something goes wrong. So why is it such a big deal, especially in a city like Baltimore?
Well, think about it. A city is basically covered in hard surfaces, right? Roofs, streets, parking lots, all that stuff. And when it rains, the water can't soak into the ground like it's supposed to. So it just runs off all those hard surfaces and it picks up all kinds of pollution and garbage along the way.
So it's like this dirty river flowing through the city. Where does all that water end up?
In Baltimore, it goes right into the storm drains and then it flows into the streams in the harbor, carrying all that pollution with it. That's where stormwater management comes in. It's all about finding ways to capture that water and clean it up and slow it down before it reaches our waterways.
So it's like a protection system for our water. And the green pattern book, it says we can use vacant lots to help with this, right?
Yep, that's right. When we transform those vacant lots into green infrastructure, they can do a lot to clean up our water and keep it safe. It's like turning a negative into a positive.
Like making lemonade out of lemons.
Yeah.
I like it. So what are some ways to make those vacant lots into little water cleaning machines?
The Green Pattern book talks about three main techniques: bioretention, rain gardens, and vegetated swales.
Okay, let's break it down. Bioretention, what's that?
Bioretention is like this specially designed landscape feature, and it basically acts like a giant filter for stormwater. It usually has a layer of sand and soil and a bunch of plants, and they all work together to clean the water.
So it's like a natural water treatment plant, right in the middle of the city.
Exactly. And they're designed so they're dry most of the time. They only hold water for a little bit when it rains really hard, so you don't have to worry about mosquitoes.
That's good to know. Where does the clean water go after it's filtered?
It either slowly goes back into the storm drain system or it soaks into the ground and helps refill the groundwater supply.
So it's a win-win. Cleaner water and more water for everyone. Okay, what about rain gardens? How are those different from bioretention areas?
Rain gardens, they're like mini bioretention areas. They're these shallow depressions, and they're planted with all these pretty flowers and grasses that love water. And you put them in places where they can catch the rainwater that runs off rooftops and sidewalks and driveways.
So they're like little sponges soaking up all that extra water. And they look nice, too.
Exactly. And they're perfect for smaller vacant lots or even just people's yards. Now let's talk about vegetated swales.
Vegetated swales, what are those?
Swales, they're basically channels, like ditches, that are designed to collect stormwater and guide it where it needs to go. But instead of just being bare dirt, vegetated swales have plants in them, like grasses and shrubs and even trees. And those plants help slow down the water and clean it up. So it's like these green corridors that manage the stormwater naturally.
Sounds way better than a boring old ditch.
It is. And they can even connect other stormwater management features like rain gardens and bioretention areas, so you have this whole network of green infrastructure working together.
It's like a team effort, right?
Exactly. And that's one of the key messages in the Green Pattern book, Stormwater Management. It works best when you think about it holistically, like a whole system.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. What are some things to think about when you're picking a spot for one of these stormwater management features?
Well, size is always a factor. Bioretention areas, those are usually bigger, while rain gardens and swales can be smaller. So it depends on how much space you have.
Right, you want the right tool for the job. What else?
You need to know where the lowest point of the lot is, because ideally you want that to be within 20 feet of a storm drain inlet, so you can connect your feature to the existing drainage system.
That makes sense. You want the water flowing in the right direction, not just pooling up randomly.
Exactly. The Green Pattern book also says it's good to think about what kind of surfaces are around the lot. Like, are there a lot of rooftops and sidewalks and parking lots that are going to create a lot of runoff? Or are those surfaces more permeable? Do they let the water soak in already?
So if the lot is already surrounded by things that let the water soak in, then you might not need to do a bioretention area or rain garden, right?
Right. You want to focus on the areas where the runoff is the biggest problem.
Okay, we've talked a lot about soil already. How does the type of soil affect these stormwater management projects?
It's really important. If the soil is really compacted, it's really hard, then the water's not going to be able to soak in very well. And that's the whole point. The Green Pattern book says if the soil is too compacted, you might need to mix in some other stuff to make it more permeable.
So sometimes you got to do a little soil prep work.
You got it. And if the soil's contaminated, then you got to call in the experts, the environmental folks, and figure out a way to clean it up. You don't want to plant anything in soil that's full of toxins.
Safety first. Okay, so besides the site and the soil, what are some other things to think about when you're doing one of these stormwater management projects?
The Green Pattern book says it's super important to talk to the people who live in the neighborhood.
Really? Why is that so important for stormwater management? It seems like something the city could just handle on its own.
Well, the city definitely has a role to play, but the residents, they know their neighborhoods better than anyone. They know where the flooding happens, where the water collects. They see it every time it rains.
Ah, so they have this insider knowledge that you wouldn't get just from looking at a map.
Exactly. And if you involve them in the design process, then you can make sure that the stormwater management features are actually going to work and that they're going to look good too. You don't want to create something that people are going to hate looking at, right?
Yeah, it should be functional A&D. Beautiful.
That's the goal. And talking to residents beforehand can also help you address any concerns they might have, like maybe they're worried about mosquitoes or about who's going to take care of it all.
So you get them on board from the beginning.
Yep, that's the idea. And the Green Pattern book has some good tips on how to do that, how to get the community involved from the very start.
Awesome. Now let's talk money. All of this, it can't be cheap, right? Are there any resources out there to help communities pay for these projects?
There are. The Green Pattern book lists a bunch of organizations that give out grants for stormwater management projects, like the Chesapeake Bay Trust and Blue Water Baltimore and the Parks and People Foundation.
That's awesome that there are groups out there that support this kind of work.
It is, and the book also mentions that sometimes developers and city agencies and industrial property owners, they might be willing to partner with communities on these projects. Like maybe they need to do some stormwater management on their own property, but they can get credit for doing it on a vacant lot in the community.
That's a great way to make everyone happy.
Right. And the Green Pattern book encourages communities to look for those opportunities because it can really help stretch their resources.
Okay, I think we've covered the basics of stormwater management. Let's switch gears again and talk about another cool idea from the Green Pattern book, green parking.
Green parking. Haha. Yeah, that sounds kind of weird, right? Like, how can a parking lot be green?
I know, it's like the opposite of green.
Right. But it's all about changing the way we think about parking lots. Instead of just being big, ugly slabs of concrete, they can be more sustainable and look a lot nicer.
So it's not about getting rid of parking altogether. It's about making it better for the environment.
That's it. And the Green Pattern book talks about some different ways to do that, like using permeable pavement and creating parking strips and adding stormwater management features.
Okay, break it down for me. What's permeable pavement?
Permeable pavement is this special kind of pavement that lets rainwater soak through it, instead of just running off. It's the opposite of regular asphalt and concrete, which don't let the water through at all.
So it's like a big sponge that absorbs all that water.
Exactly. And the Green Pattern book talks about all the good things that happen when you use permeable pavement.
Like what? Tell me more.
Well, first of all, it reduces stormwater runoff, which is a big deal, right? We were just talking about that. So instead of all that water rushing into the storm drains, it soaks into the ground and helps replenish the groundwater.
That's great for the environment. Are there any other benefits?
Yeah, it can also help with something called the heat island effect. That's when cities get really hot, hotter than the areas around them because all the concrete and asphalt absorbs so much heat. Permeable pavement doesn't absorb as much heat, so it can actually help keep the city cooler, especially in the summer.
So it's like giving the city a break from the heat.
Yep, that's a good way to put it. Now let's talk about parking strips.
Parking strips, what are those?
A parking strip is basically a narrow strip of pavement, and it's set within a grassy area. So you have a hard surface for the car tires, but you're not paving over the whole area.
So it's like a compromise between a parking lot and a lawn.
Exactly. And the green pattern book says they're a good option for areas where there's not a exactly. And the green pattern book says they're a good option for areas where there's not a lot of traffic, like residential streets where there isn't much on-street parking.
So you're adding parking spaces without paving over all the green stuff. Okay, what about those stormwater management features? I thought we were talking about parking lots, not rain gardens.
Well, you can use those same features in a parking lot, like rain gardens and bioswales, or even those underground systems that let the water soak in. It's all about making parking lots more sustainable and more attractive.
So instead of the water just running off into the street, it gets absorbed and filtered. Ah,
Exactly. And the green pattern book says you can incorporate those features right into the design so they look good and they work well.
it's like a win-win-win. Okay, let's say a community decides they want to try this.
The green pattern book says a good place to start is looking at those vacant lots that are owned by the city, the ones that are tucked away in those little alleyways.
Yeah, those lots. You don't see them very often, but they're all over the city.
Right. They're not usually big enough to build houses or anything, but they could be perfect for parking, especially for people who live in those neighborhoods where it's hard to find a place to park.
So it's like turning those hidden spaces into something useful for the community. I like it.
Me too. And the green pattern book also says you can use corner lots for this, or those little gaps in a row of houses. They call those missing tooth lots. Those could be good spots for green parking too, especially if people want off-street parking right next to their houses.
So there are lots of options depending on what you're trying to do. Okay, so what else should you think about when you're choosing a site for green parking?
Well, you need to know how many parking spaces you need because that's going to determine how big the lot needs to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you probably want to make sure it's easy for people to get to, right?
Definitely. Location is key. And then you have to think about the slope of the land. It's easier if it's flat. And how many trees there are already.
Right. Okay, we've talked a lot about soil today. How does the soil affect green parking techniques, like that permeable pavement stuff? Does it need a special kind of soil?
Yeah, it does. For permeable pavement to work, the water needs to be able to drain away easily. So if the soil is too compacted or if it's mostly clay, then it's not going to work very well.
So you might have to do a soil test to see if permeable pavement is even an option.
Yep, that's right. The Green Pattern Book says that soil testing is a really important step in any green parking project.
Okay, so you've got your site, you've checked the soil, now it's time to design the parking lot. What are some things to keep in mind?
The Green Pattern Book says it's important to use as little new pavement as possible. So if there's already some pavement there, use that. And be strategic about where you put the new pavement so you're not paving over more than you have to.
So less pavement, more green stuff.
Exactly. And they also talk about making sure that the land is sloped the right way so the water flows toward those drainage areas, the rain gardens and bioswales.
You don't want the water pooling up in the wrong places.
Nope. And then you got to think about things like marking off the parking spaces and planting trees and shrubs for shade and adding some light so it's safe at night.
Wow, so much to think about.
There is. But it's all worth it, to create a parking lot that looks good, works well, and doesn't hurt the environment.
Okay, let's talk maintenance. Who's in charge of taking care of these green parking lots?
It depends on who owns a lot. If it's a city-owned lot that's been adopted by a community group, then they would usually take care of it. But if
Okay.
it's a private lot, then the owner would be responsible for the maintenance.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are some of the things you have to do to keep a green parking lot in good shape?
Well, that permeable pavement, you have to sweep it and vacuum it regularly to keep it from getting clogged up with dirt and debris. It's a little bit more work than just hosing down a regular parking lot.
So permeable pavement is a little high maintenance.
It is, but it's worth it. And then, of course, if you have any grassy areas or landscaping, those need to be mowed and trimmed regularly. And those stormwater management features like the rain gardens and bioswales, those need to be taken care of too so they keep working properly.
It sounds like green parking lots. They're a little more work than regular parking lots, but the benefits make it worthwhile.
Definitely. And the Green Pattern Book really stresses that you need to have a good plan for maintenance from the very beginning. And you need to make sure you have the resources to do it, whether it's volunteers or paid contractors.
Planning and commitment are key. Okay, I'm curious, do you have any favorite green parking projects in Baltimore? Ones that you think are doing a really great job.
Oh, yeah, I do. One that comes to mind is the new Broadway East Community Park. It's on North Gay Street.
Tell me about it. What makes it so green?
Well, it's this 1/3 acre park, and it used to be the site of 18 vacant houses. Can you believe that? The Parks and People Foundation and this nonprofit called Humanim, they help people with disabilities, and the new Broadway East Community Association, they all work together to turn this rundown area into this awesome community park. And part of that park is a green parking lot.
Wow. Turning vacant houses into a park, that's pretty amazing.
Right.
What did they do to make the parking lot eco-friendly?
They use this special porous paving for the main path through the park and for the plaza area and for the parking lot itself. So when it rains, the water soaks right through the pavement, and that helps reduce runoff and recharge the groundwater.
So the parking lot is actually helping to clean up the water. I love it. What else did they do?
They planted 24 big trees throughout the park, which provide shade and make it look really nice.
It sounds like a beautiful space.
It is, and the Green Pattern book holds up the new Broadway East Community Park as a great example of how to do green parking right, you know? They made the parking lot part of this bigger green space, and it's a place where people can gather and enjoy the outdoors. It's really great.
It sounds like a model for other communities to follow. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into the Green Pattern book, I gotta ask, what's the one thing you hope people will take away from all of this?
I think the main takeaway is that every space, even the ones that seem like they're beyond hope, you know, those neglected spaces, those abandoned buildings, they can all be part of a better city, a city that's more sustainable and more equitable and just more vibrant.
It's all about changing our perspective,
Mm.
right? Looking at those vacant lots and seeing opportunities instead of problems.
Exactly. And the Green Pattern book shows us how to do that. It's not just a bunch of ideas, it's a practical guide. It tells you what to do step by step, and it gives you resources, and it shows you examples of what other people have done. It's really inspiring.
It's like a call to action. It's saying, hey, we can do this. We can create a greener, healthier, more beautiful Baltimore.
That's it. And for our listeners who want to learn more and maybe even get involved, make sure to check out our website. We'll have a link to the Green Pattern book and information about all those great organizations that are working to make this happen.
So the next time you see a vacant lot, don't just see an empty space. See the potential for something amazing. A community garden, a rain garden, an urban farm, even a green parking lot. See the potential for a better Baltimore.